My name is Danae, and at 34, I was the best cybersecurity analyst at Securitech until I found a critical flaw in our government project. Jackson Montgomery, our new director, had made it clear that challenges to his authority weren't tolerated. When my security report landed on his desk, his reply was dismissive. Noted, stay in your lane. 3 weeks later, he fired me in front of the entire company. What he never expected was that I had already prepared my checkmate move. Let me know where you're watching from, and hit that subscribe button as I share how federal whistleblower laws saved national security and my career. Before diving into the corporate drama that unfolded at Securitech, let me give you some context about who I am and how I ended up in this situation. I graduated from MIT with a double major in computer science and cybersecurity. The digital world always fascinated me, not just building systems, but protecting them from those who sought to exploit vulnerabilities. After college, I worked at several respected tech firms, building my reputation as someone who could spot weaknesses others missed. My colleagues used to joke that I had a sixth sense for finding backdoors in supposedly secure systems. 4 years ago, I joined Securitech, a defense contractor specializing in developing secure communication systems for government agencies. We were the company behind the encrypted networks used by diplomats, intelligence officers, and military personnel. Our work wasn't just about corporate profits. Lives literally depended on the security of our systems. When I first joined Securitech, the company culture was centered around rigorous testing and security protocols. Our previous director, William Parker, had a background in naval intelligence and understood that in our line of work there was no room for error. Better to delay a launch than deploy a vulnerability was his motto. He created an environment where raising security concerns was not just accepted but expected. My immediate team consisted of people who became both colleagues and friends. Abigail Mercer, a 50-something security veteran who had been with the company since its founding, became my mentor. She had forgotten more about cryptography than most people would ever learn. Marcus Diaz, a coding prodigy who could write elegant security solutions that seemed almost artistic, always had my back in team meetings. And while not on my direct team, Rebecca Taylor in HR was known as one of the few people in management who genuinely tried to balance company interests with employee well-being. The project that would eventually lead to my confrontation with the new director was codenamed Sentinel. It was a next-generation secure communication system for military field operations. Sentinel was designed to provide encrypted, unhackable communications even in hostile territory where adversaries might be actively trying to intercept or jam signals. The contract was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but more importantly, it would be deployed to protect service members in dangerous situations worldwide. Everything changed 6 months ago when Director Parker announced his retirement. He had been battling cancer privately, and his doctors had finally convinced him to step away from the stress of the job to focus on his treatment. His departure left a vacuum at the top, and the board of directors began searching for a replacement. Rumors started circulating about the frontrunner for the position. Jackson Montgomery had a reputation for aggressive management and delivering projects ahead of schedule at his previous companies. Former employees who had worked under him described him as results-oriented to a fault and not someone who tolerates disagreement. Several people in my network sent me private messages warning about his management style when they heard he was being considered for Securitech. He values speed over thoroughness, one former colleague warned me, and he expects absolute loyalty to his decisions. Despite these warnings, the board was impressed by his track record of landing government contracts and his connections in Washington. In an industry where government relationships often determined which companies received contracts, those connections were invaluable. The announcement of his appointment came on a Monday morning. A company-wide email introduced Jackson Montgomery as our new Director of Operations, effective immediately. The email highlighted his proven track record of innovation and efficiency and his commitment to excellence. Nothing about security expertise or technical background. That should have been my first red flag. Little did I know that this appointment would set in motion a chain of events that would test my professional integrity, courage, and ultimately change the trajectory of my career in ways I could never have anticipated. Jackson Montgomery made an entrance his first day that set the tone for his leadership style. He arrived in a custom Italian suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary, flanked by 2 assistants, frantically taking notes on tablets as he barked instructions. The company had organized a welcome breakfast, but he was 45 minutes late, leaving executives and team leaders awkwardly making small talk while periodically checking their watches. When he finally arrived, he didn't apologize for his tardiness. Instead, he launched into a 20-minute speech about his vision for Securitech, without touching the coffee or pastries set out for the occasion. The previous administration ran a tight ship, but times are changing, he announced, scanning the room with piercing blue eyes that seemed to evaluate everyone's worth in real time. Government contracts are becoming more competitive. Our rivals are promising faster delivery, more features, more innovation. We need to adapt, or we'll be left behind. By that afternoon, the first company-wide email from Montgomery outlined immediate changes. All project timelines were to be reviewed and compressed where possible. All expenditures over $1,000 now required director approval. All hiring was frozen pending a strategic workforce assessment. And most concerning to me, the multi-layer security review process was to be streamlined to reduce unnecessary redundancies. Within a week, it became clear that Montgomery had brought his inner circle with him. Robert Winters, a stern-faced man with a permanently furrowed brow, was installed as deputy director. He had worked with Montgomery at 2 previous companies and functioned as his enforcer. Elena Fisher, an ambitious project manager known for delivering results, regardless of the human cost, was promoted to oversee all major government projects, including Sentinel. Neither had backgrounds in security. My first direct interaction with Montgomery came during the 3rd project status meeting after his arrival. I raised concerns about the compressed testing schedule for a new authentication protocol in Sentinel. The standard process calls for 8 weeks of penetration testing, I explained. The revised timeline only allows for 3. Montgomery fixed me with a cold stare. And you are? Danae Alexander, lead security analyst for Sentinel, I replied. Well, Danae, the standard process was designed in a different era. We're implementing more efficient testing methodologies across all projects. With respect, sir, the 8-week testing period exists because that's how long it takes to thoroughly probe for vulnerabilities in a system this complex. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Montgomery's expression hardened. Thank you for your input, Miss Alexander, but I suggest you stay in your lane. The testing schedule has been approved and will be moving forward as planned. That phrase, stay in your lane, would become Montgomery's catchphrase whenever anyone questioned his decisions. I would hear it countless times in the coming months, and it would eventually appear in the email that would seal his fate. After the meeting, Abigail pulled me aside in the hallway. You need to be careful, Danae, she whispered, glancing around to ensure no one was within earshot. Montgomery isn't like Parker. He has connections in the Pentagon, Congress, even the White House. People who cross him tend to find themselves sidelined or worse. So we're just supposed to implement systems with known security risks because he says so, I asked, not bothering to hide my frustration. I'm not saying roll over. Just be strategic. Document everything. Build allies. Choose your battles carefully. Over the next few months, the workplace culture transformed. The collaborative atmosphere was replaced by competition and fear. Team meetings that once featured open discussions became one-way information sessions where Montgomery or his deputies would outline expectations and deadlines that seemed increasingly impossible. The pressure to cut corners became implicit then explicit. Code reviews were shortened. Documentation requirements were reduced. Testing phases were conducted in parallel rather than sequentially, all in the name of efficiency. I watched as colleagues who had once been sticklers for security best practices began to compromise, justifying each small concession as necessary for the greater good, or more honestly, for keeping their jobs. Even Marcus, who had always been outspoken about quality standards, began keeping his head down in meetings. It's not worth it, Danae, he told me, after I challenged Robert Winters on a shortened encryption verification process. They're building a case against anyone who doesn't fall in line. Elena has a list of problem employees she reviews with Montgomery weekly. Is my name on it? I asked. Marcus's uncomfortable silence was answer enough. The situation came to a head during a design review for Sentinel's emergency authentication override, a critical feature that would allow command centers to issue emergency instructions even if standard authentication was compromised or unavailable. The original design called for a sophisticated multi-factor authentication system. The revised design pushed by Elena simplified this to a single authentication factor to reduce complexity in emergency situations. I spent 3 days preparing a detailed analysis of the security implications, complete with examples from previous breaches where similar shortcuts had led to catastrophic failures. When I presented my findings, Montgomery cut me off halfway through. "We're not paid to create theoretical security utopias, Miss Alexander," he said dismissively. "We're paid to deliver working systems on time and on budget. The override design has been approved by the client representative." What he didn't mention was that the client representative was a political appointee with no cybersecurity background who had been golfing buddies with Montgomery for years. "Stay in your lane," he concluded, before moving on to the next agenda item as if I hadn't spoken. That evening I found an email from Robert Winters informing me that I was being reassigned from the design team to the documentation team, effectively a demotion disguised as a lateral move. The message was clear: continue to raise concerns, and worse would follow. But they had underestimated both my stubbornness and my foresight. I had been meticulously documenting every security compromise, every shortened test, every ignored warning. I kept copies of emails, recorded meetings in accordance with our state's one-party consent laws, and maintained a detailed log of all security decisions that deviated from best practices. I didn't know exactly how this information might be used, but something told me it would be important. That instinct would prove correct sooner than I expected. 3 weeks after my reassignment to the documentation team, I found myself working late on a Friday night. Most people had left for the weekend, but I had stayed behind using the quiet time to thoroughly review the technical specifications for Sentinel's emergency authentication override, the same feature I had raised concerns about earlier. My official role now was simply to ensure the documentation matched the implementation, not to evaluate the security implications. But old habits die hard, and as I cross-referenced the code with the specifications, something caught my eye. The authentication system relied on a specific type of encryption key exchange that, while generally secure, had a known vulnerability when implemented in certain configurations. The vulnerability was obscure, documented in academic papers, but rarely seen in the wild, because most implementations took precautions to avoid the specific conditions that created the weakness. But as I dug deeper into the code, my stomach tightened into a knot. The Sentinel implementation had all the ingredients for the vulnerability: the specific configuration, the timeout parameters, and crucially, the lack of a secondary verification step that would normally catch exploitation attempts. I pulled up the test results for this module, hoping I was missing something. The standard tests would have caught this issue, but then I remembered the testing protocol had been streamlined. The specific tests that would have flagged this vulnerability had been marked as redundant and eliminated from the test suite. My hands shook slightly as I began to understand the implications. This wasn't just a minor security flaw. It was potentially catastrophic. The vulnerability would allow an adversary with sophisticated capabilities to forge authentication credentials during the specific window when the emergency override was activated. In practical terms, this meant that during a crisis, exactly when the system would be most critical, an enemy could potentially issue false commands that would appear legitimate to field units. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I ran the analysis 3 more times, approaching it from different angles, hoping to prove myself wrong. But each verification confirmed my initial finding. This was real, and it was serious. I considered calling Abigail immediately, but checked the time. It was nearly midnight. Instead, I documented everything, meticulously capturing screenshots, saving code snippets, and writing a detailed analysis of the vulnerability and its potential impact. I encrypted the files and saved them both to my secure work drive and to an encrypted USB drive I kept for backup. Sleep eluded me that night. I kept imagining scenarios where the vulnerability was exploited. False retreat orders sent to troops in defensive positions, misleading coordinates provided to aircraft on critical missions, chaos created by contradictory commands during the 7 crisis situations. The human cost could be immeasurable. First thing Monday morning, I sought out Abigail in the small break room she frequented before the daily status meeting. "I need your eyes on something," I told her quietly, sliding a printout of my findings across the table, in private. She raised an eyebrow but nodded, and we found an empty conference room. As she reviewed my analysis, her expression grew increasingly grim. "You verified this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 times, different methods, same conclusion. She removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. This is exactly the kind of thing the original testing protocol would have caught. What do we do? This can't go into production. Abigail was silent for a long moment. Protocol says we report it up the chain, document it, formally submit through the security exception system. To Montgomery. He'll bury it. You know he will. Maybe. Probably. But if we don't follow protocol, they'll use that against us. We need to do this by the book, create a paper trail that can't be ignored or erased. I nodded slowly. She was right. Whatever happened next, I needed to ensure I had followed every procedure correctly. I'll support you, Abigail added, but be prepared, this won't go well. I spent the rest of the day drafting the formal security exception report. The document detailed the vulnerability, provided evidence of its existence in the current implementation, outlined the potential consequences if exploited, and proposed solutions. The fix wasn't even particularly complex or time-consuming. Adding a secondary verification step would close the vulnerability without significantly impacting performance or usability. Before submitting it, I reviewed the report once more, ensuring every claim was substantiated and every technical detail accurate. Then I took a deep breath and clicked send. The email with the attached report went to Montgomery with copies to Robert Winters, Elena Fisher, and the security compliance mailbox as required by company policy. Then I waited. Hours passed with no response. I checked my email, constantly jumping slightly each time a new message arrived, but none were related to my report. The day ended and still nothing. The next morning I found a terse email from Montgomery that had arrived at 1:47 p.m. Miss Alexander, report received and reviewed. Security concerns noted. Project timeline remains unchanged. Stay in your lane. JM. That was it. No acknowledgement of the severity of the issue. No discussion of potential fixes. No follow-up questions about the technical details. Just noted, and the now familiar admonishment to stay in my lane. I forwarded the exchange to Abigail, who responded with a single line. Document everything. We're in uncharted territory now. She was right. We had moved beyond standard procedural disagreements into something far more serious. If the company knowingly deployed a system with a critical security vulnerability to the military, the implications went beyond corporate politics. This was about national security, about the lives of service members who would rely on Sentinel. I didn't know it yet, but Montgomery's dismissive 4-sentence email would eventually become Exhibit A in a federal investigation that would shake Securitech to its foundations. Over the next week, I attempted to follow up on the vulnerability through every appropriate channel. I scheduled a meeting with Elena Fisher to discuss the security exception report, but she canceled at the last minute. I emailed Robert Winters requesting clarification on how the issue would be addressed. He responded that the matter has been reviewed at the appropriate level and directed me back to Montgomery's initial response. When technical channels failed, I tried going through human resources. Rebecca Taylor in HR had always been fair, and while she wasn't in a position to evaluate technical concerns, she could at least ensure proper procedures were being followed. I understand your frustration, Rebecca said after I explained the situation in her small office. But from a procedural standpoint, it appears the report was submitted and acknowledged. Unless you can demonstrate that company policy requires a more specific response, there's not much HR can do. This isn't about policy technicalities, I insisted. This is about a serious security vulnerability being ignored. I hear you, she said, lowering her voice. But between us, things are different now. Montgomery has the board's complete confidence. He's brought in 3 major contracts in 6 months. Nobody wants to rock the boat. She hesitated, then added, and Danae people are talking. You might want to be careful about pursuing this further. The warning was clear. I was making enemies, and my professional reputation was at risk. In the days that followed, I noticed subtle changes in how colleagues interacted with me. Conversations stopped when I approached. Invitations to team lunches dried up. In meetings, people avoided eye contact. I was becoming isolated, a dangerous position in corporate politics. Marcus confirmed my suspicions one evening as we were leaving the building. They're building a narrative about you, he said as we walked to the parking garage. Elena's been telling people you're resistant to change, that you're undermining team morale with unnecessary alarmism. Alarmism. It's a legitimate security vulnerability. I know that. but most people don't have the technical background to evaluate your claims independently. They hear what management tells them. The pressure campaign intensified. Projects I had completed months ago were suddenly being revisited and criticized for minor issues that had never been flagged during initial reviews. My current work was subjected to unprecedented scrutiny, with Robert Winters personally reviewing my documentation and finding fault with formatting inconsistencies and stylistic choices that had never been issues before. During one particularly tense project review, I noticed Robert and Elena exchanging glances when the Sentinel timeline was discussed. The implementation date remained unchanged, which meant they were proceeding with the flawed system despite my warning. More disturbingly, I discovered that my access to certain parts of the codebase had been restricted, officially for project streamlining, but the effect was to prevent me from monitoring whether the vulnerability was being addressed. As the professional pressure mounted, I began researching my options. I reviewed company policies on security reporting and whistleblowing. Securitech, like most defense contractors, had explicit policies protecting employees who reported security concerns. But policies were only as good as the people enforcing them, and it was clear that the current leadership had no intention of honoring these protections. One evening, while reviewing federal regulations related to government contracts, I came across the Federal Whistleblower Protection Act. The act provided specific protections for employees of government contractors who reported serious issues affecting government interests, particularly in areas touching on national security. As I dug deeper into the regulations, I realized that the path forward might lie outside the company's internal processes. But pursuing this route would mean crossing a Rubicon. There would be no going back, and the professional consequences could be severe. While I was weighing my options, an unexpected email arrived from an anonymous address. The subject line was simply Montgomery History, and the body contained only a link to an encrypted file-sharing service. My cybersecurity instincts made me cautious about clicking unknown links, but my curiosity was piqued. After taking security precautions, I accessed the link. The files contained news articles and internal documents from Montgomery's previous companies. A pattern emerged: aggressive timeline compression, dismissed security concerns, and eventually significant failures that were quietly resolved through settlements and non-disclosure agreements. Most disturbing was a redacted internal investigation from his previous employer regarding a security breach in a law enforcement communication system. The conclusion had been removed, but the summary noted multiple ignored warnings about potential vulnerabilities. The final item in the folder was a contact number for someone identified only as LW, a former employee from Montgomery's previous company. I called the number from a secure line the next day. "This is Laura Wellington," a cautious voice answered. "Who's asking?" "My name is Danae Alexander. I'm a security analyst at Securitech. I received your contact information regarding Jackson Montgomery." There was a long pause. "You found something, didn't you? And he shut you down?" "Yes. How did you know?" "Because that's his playbook. I was chief security architect at Next Gen Systems when he took over. I identified critical vulnerabilities in a system designed for federal law enforcement. He buried my reports, marginalized me, and eventually forced me out. 6 months after I left, the system was breached. They covered it up, but the damage was done." "What happened to you?" "I tried to fight it internally. I didn't know about the whistleblower protections then. By the time I figured it out, the statute of limitations had run out. Learn from my mistake, Danae. Document everything. Know your rights, and be prepared for them to come after you hard." Armed with this information and a growing sense of responsibility, I began systematically preparing for what might come next. I organized all my documentation chronologically: the original vulnerability report, all subsequent communications, evidence of retaliation, and the technical details that even a non-specialist could understand. I researched attorneys specializing in whistleblower cases, making a short list of those with experience in defense contracting. I reviewed the specific procedures for filing a federal whistleblower complaint, understanding that timing and exactness would be crucial. And throughout it all, I continued to perform my assigned duties impeccably, giving them no legitimate cause for termination. If they were building a case against me, I was determined not to make it easy for them. What I didn't know was that Montgomery had already decided my fate, and he was planning to make an example of me in the most public way possible. The company-wide email arrived on a Wednesday afternoon: mandatory all-hands meeting, Thursday 10 a.m., attendance required. Such meetings were rare at Securitech, typically reserved for major announcements like new government contracts or significant organizational changes. That evening, Marcus called me from his personal phone. "Something big is happening tomorrow," he said, his voice tight with tension. "Montgomery and Elena have been in closed-door meetings all day. Robert's been collecting information from your personnel file." "They're going to fire me," I said, surprised at how calm I felt now that the moment was approaching. "It looks that way. But why at an all-hands? That's not normal protocol." I understood immediately. He wants to make an example of me. A public execution to warn others. "Danae, maybe you should call in sick tomorrow. Give yourself some time to—" "No," I interrupted. "If they're going to do this, they can look me in the eye while they do it." I spent that evening finalizing my preparations. I backed up all my documentation to secure locations, confirmed that my personal devices were clean of any company data that might give them leverage against me, and reviewed the whistleblower filing procedures one last time. Whatever happened tomorrow, I would be ready for the next step. The next morning I dressed with particular care, a charcoal suit, minimal jewelry, hair pulled back neatly. Professional. Unassailable. I arrived at the office 30 minutes early, nodding to the security guard as if it were any other day. By 9:45 a.m. employees were streaming into the main conference center, a space large enough to hold all 300 Securitech staff. I chose a seat near the back, not hiding, but not drawing attention either. Abigail caught my eye from across the room and gave me a barely perceptible nod of support. At precisely 10 a.m. Montgomery Street rode onto the small stage at the front of the room, flanked by Robert, Elena, and two people I recognized from the legal department. The room fell silent. "Thank you all for being here," Montgomery began, his voice carrying effortlessly through the space. "At Securitech, we pride ourselves on excellence, integrity, and teamwork. Our clients trust us with their most sensitive systems because they know we deliver quality without compromise." He paced the stage with the confidence of someone who had never had their judgment questioned. "But maintaining that trust requires vigilance, not just in our technical work, but in our company culture. It requires everyone to understand their role and to fulfill that role with professionalism." His eyes scanned the room, and I knew he was looking for me. Unfortunately, not everyone embraces these principles. Some individuals believe they know better than their leaders, better than the established processes, better than the collective wisdom of the organization. He found me then, and our eyes locked. "Danae Alexander, please stand." A wave of whispers rippled through the room as I slowly rose to my feet, back straight, expression neutral. Miss Alexander has been with Securitech for 4 years. During that time, she has demonstrated technical competence, but also a concerning pattern of behavior. She has repeatedly questioned strategic decisions, circumvented the chain of command, and most recently attempted to undermine a critical client project with unfounded security concerns. The projection screen behind him suddenly displayed my security exception report with key sections highlighted out of context to make them appear alarmist. Miss Alexander seems to believe that her judgment supersedes that of the entire leadership team, the client representatives, and the expert consultants we've engaged. Next came my email exchanges with Montgomery, and others carefully edited to remove critical context. When directed to focus on her assigned responsibilities, documentation in this case, she continued to overstep her authority. Finally, he displayed his own response email with, "Stay in your lane," prominently highlighted. Despite clear guidance, Miss Alexander has continued to create discord within her team and spread unwarranted concerns about project security. He fixed me with a cold stare. This kind of insubordination and fear-mongering has no place at Securitech. Effective immediately, Danae Alexander is terminated from her position. Security will escort her to collect her personal belongings. The room was dead silent. 300 colleagues, many of whom I had worked alongside for years, watched as 2 security guards approached my position. I maintained eye contact with Montgomery for one long moment before turning to leave, head held high. As I was escorted through the maze of cubicles to my desk, I could feel eyes following me, some sympathetic, some curious, many simply relieved it wasn't them. I collected my few personal items in silence. A framed photo of my parents, a ceramic mug my niece had made, a small plant that had somehow survived 4 years of office life. One of the guards, Sam, who I'd always exchanged friendly greetings with in the mornings, leaned in slightly. "This isn't right," he whispered. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry." I nodded my thanks but kept packing. There was nothing to be gained by words now. As I was escorted out of the building, I noticed Abigail hurrying toward the parking lot. She reached her car just as I was approaching mine. "Danae," she called, walking briskly toward me. The security guards tensed, but she ignored them. "I left something in your car this morning. A thumb drive. You'll want to review it carefully." Before I could respond, she turned and walked away. The guards exchanged glances but said nothing. Technically, she hadn't broken any rules. The drive home passed in a blur. 4 years of work relationships, professional identity, all severed in a 10-minute character assassination. I had expected it, prepared for it, but the reality still hit hard. When I finally pulled into my driveway, tears came. Not gentle, dignified tears, but racking sobs that shook my entire body. I allowed myself this moment of grief and shock, knowing that once it passed, the real work would begin. After composing myself, I found the thumb drive Abigail had mentioned tucked under the passenger seat of my car. It contained a trove of internal documents, emails between Montgomery, Elena, and Robert, discussing how to handle the Danae situation, technical assessments from external consultants that actually validated my security concerns, but had been shelved, and most damning of all, an email from Montgomery to a Pentagon contact, assuring them that all security issues had been thoroughly addressed when they clearly had not been. I now had everything I needed. The vulnerability was real. The company knew about it. They were deliberately concealing it from the government client, and they had fired me for attempting to report it. It was time to become a whistleblower. The morning after my termination, I began the complex process of filing a federal whistleblower complaint. The Federal Whistleblower Protection Act is designed to protect employees who report violations of law, gross mismanagement, abuse of authority, or dangers to public health and safety. My case: a defense contractor knowingly delivering a flawed security system to the military, fell squarely within these parameters. My first step was contacting Laura Steele, an attorney specializing in whistleblower cases involving government contractors. Her office was located in a modest building downtown, nothing like the gleaming glass towers that housed corporate law firms. This, I would learn, was typical of attorneys in her specialization. They operated on contingency fees because their clients were often recently unemployed. "The good news," Laura said after reviewing my documentation for 2 hours, "is that you've done everything right so far. You reported through proper channels, documented the response, and can demonstrate retaliation. The technical evidence of the vulnerability is compelling even to a non-specialist like me." "And the bad news?" I asked. "This won't be quick or easy. Securitech has resources, connections, and every incentive to discredit you. Montgomery sounds like the type who makes enemies easily, but allies who protect him for their own interests. We need to be meticulous and patient." Over the next week, we assembled the formal complaint for submission to the Department of Defense Office of Inspector General. The document ran to over 80 pages with attachments detailing the technical nature of the vulnerability and its potential impact on military operations, at an A, my attempts to report through proper channels, the company's dismissal of legitimate security concerns, at a A, the pattern of retaliation leading to my termination, evidence that Securitech was knowingly delivering a flawed system to a government client. Filing the complaint was both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because I was taking on a powerful corporation with political connections. Liberating because after months of being silenced, I was finally taking action to address a serious security threat. The waiting period that followed was one of the most difficult times of my life. Unemployment brought financial stress. Defense contractors pay well, but Washington, D.C. is an expensive city, and my savings wouldn't last forever. I began applying for new positions, but quickly discovered that word had spread within the industry. Interviews that had begun enthusiastically cooled once hiring managers realized I was that whistleblower from Securitech. "It's not about the merits of your case," one recruiter told me candidly. "Companies worry that hiring you sends a message that they encourage whistleblowing. It's unfair, but that's the reality." Professional isolation was accompanied by social isolation. Many colleagues who had been friends as well as coworkers suddenly became unavailable, not returning texts or calls. I understood. They had mortgages, children and college retirement plans. that depended on their continued employment. Association with me had become risky. There were exceptions. Marcus called regularly, providing updates from within Securitech. They're in full damage control mode, he reported about 2 weeks after my termination. Montgomery's telling everyone you were fired for performance issues, but nobody who worked with you believes it. And they're fast-tracking Sentinel, trying to get it deployed before anything can interrupt the process. Abigail, who had taken a calculated risk by passing me the thumb drive, maintained contact through encrypted messages, careful to never use company devices or networks. Stay strong, she wrote. More people support you than you know. They're just scared. The federal investigation moved with methodical deliberation. 3 weeks after filing, I was contacted by Special Agent Karen Torres from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, the law enforcement arm of the DoD Inspector General. We've reviewed your complaint and supporting documentation, she explained during our first meeting at a federal building downtown. The technical aspects have been evaluated by our cybersecurity team, and they concur with your assessment of the vulnerability. So you'll stop the deployment, I asked hopefully. It's not that simple. We need to build a case that will stand up to scrutiny. Securitech will have high-powered attorneys and experts arguing that the vulnerability is theoretical or manageable. We need to be absolutely certain of our ground before taking action. Over the following weeks, I met repeatedly with Agent Torres and her team, walking them through the technical details, explaining the documentation, and answering countless questions about Securitech's procedures and Montgomery's management. Each session left me mentally exhausted, but increasingly confident that the investigators understood the severity of the situation. 2 months after my termination, I received an unexpected call from Agent Torres. We're moving forward, she said without preamble. Based on our investigation, we've determined that the security vulnerability presents a clear and present danger to military operations if deployed. We've briefed the Pentagon, and they've ordered a halt to the Sentinel implementation, pending full security review. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The system wouldn't be deployed in its vulnerable state. Whatever happened to me professionally, service members wouldn't be put at risk. What happens next, I asked. We're executing a search warrant at Securitech tomorrow morning. We'll be seizing documents, emails, and code repositories related to Sentinel, and we'd like you to be there. At Securitech, why? Your technical expertise will be valuable for identifying relevant materials. And there's another reason. I could hear a smile in her voice. We find that having the whistleblower present tends to focus the minds of those being investigated. It demonstrates the seriousness of our intentions. The thought of returning to Securitech, of facing Montgomery, and the others who had vilified me, sent a jolt of anxiety through me. But mixed with the anxiety was something else, a sense of validation of justice beginning to unfold. What time do we start? I asked. The federal agents arrived at Securitech at precisely 9 the next morning, 4 SUVs with government plates pulling up to the main entrance in a coordinated maneuver. I sat in the back of Agent Torres's vehicle, my heart pounding so loudly, I was certain she could hear it. Ready? She asked, her expression professional but with a hint of understanding. I nodded, straightening my jacket. Ready. We entered the lobby as a group, 8 federal agents in suits flanking Agent Torres and me. The security guard at the front desk, the same one who had escorted me out 2 months earlier, did a double take when he saw me. Federal Agent Torres announced, displaying her credentials. We have a warrant to seize documents and electronic records related to Project Sentinel. Please contact your legal department immediately. Within minutes, the lobby was filled with confused employees and panicked managers. Robert Winters appeared, his face flushed with anger that turned to shock when he spotted me standing beside the federal agents. What is the meaning of this? He demanded, addressing Torres while pointedly ignoring me. As I said, we're executing a federal search warrant. Your legal team has been provided with the details. I suggest you cooperate fully to minimize disruption to your operations. The commotion attracted more attention, and soon Elena Fisher appeared, followed by 2 attorneys from the legal department. Their expressions cycled through confusion, alarm, and finally grim resignation as they realized what was happening. We'll need access to your secure server room, the Sentinel project documentation, and the workstations of key personnel, Torres continued, unfazed by the growing audience. Miss Alexander will assist us in identifying relevant technical materials. The mention of my name sent a visible ripple through the assembled group. Elena's eyes narrowed, and one of the attorneys began whispering urgently into his phone. "Where is Director Montgomery?" Torres asked. "He's in a meeting off-site," Robert replied stiffly. "Call him. Tell him to return immediately. My team will wait." For the next hour, federal agents secured workstations and server access while we waited for Montgomery to arrive. I assisted as needed, identifying key technical repositories and documentation locations, aware of the stares and whispers from former colleagues. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Others gave subtle nods of support when they thought no one was watching. Abigail approached at one point ostensibly to provide information about server configurations and whispered, "You did the right thing. We all know it." Montgomery finally arrived, striding into the conference room where we had gathered with the legal team. He stopped abruptly when he saw me, his face darkening. "What is she doing here?" he demanded. "Miss Alexander is assisting with our investigation as a technical expert," Torres replied calmly. "Please have a seat, Mr. Montgomery." His confidence visibly faltered as he took in the scene. Federal agents systematically working through the building, his leadership team looking shaken, and me, the employee he had publicly humiliated, now returned with the full authority of the federal government behind me. Torres outlined the investigation, explaining that preliminary findings indicated Securitech had knowingly attempted to deliver a flawed security system to the Department of Defense. "These are outrageous accusations," Montgomery blustered. "We have a spotless record of delivering secure systems to government clients." "Then you won't mind us reviewing all communication regarding the security vulnerability identified by Miss Alexander," Torres replied. "We're particularly interested in this email chain." She slid a printout across the table. My original security report, followed by Montgomery's dismissive, "Stay in your lane" response, followed by subsequent emails in which he assured Pentagon officials that all security concerns had been thoroughly addressed. The company's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Jonathan Bennett, picked up the documents and began reading. As he progressed through the pages, his expression grew increasingly grave. When he reached Montgomery's assurances to the Pentagon, his breathing became noticeably shallow. Director Montgomery Bennett said quietly, "A word in private, please." "There's nothing to discuss," Montgomery snapped. "This is a witch hunt based on the claims of a disgruntled former employee." "I strongly advise we speak privately," Bennett insisted, his tone leaving no room for argument. As they stepped out, I noticed Robert and Elena exchanging worried glances. The facade of corporate unity was beginning to crack. Bennett and Montgomery returned 15 minutes later. Montgomery's demeanor had changed dramatically, the bluster replaced by tightly controlled fury, and something else, fear. "Securitech will cooperate fully with your investigation," Bennett announced formally. "We take these allegations seriously and are committed to addressing any legitimate security concerns with Project Sentinel." Torres nodded. "In light of preliminary findings, the Department of Defense has suspended all work on Sentinel pending a complete security review. Your company is hereby ordered to preserve all related documents and materials." The meeting concluded with arrangements for ongoing cooperation with the investigation. As I prepared to leave with the federal team, Montgomery approached, stopping just within earshot. "You won't work in this industry again," he said, voice low and venomous. "I'll make sure of it." Before I could respond, Torres stepped between us. "That sounded remarkably like a threat of retaliation against a protected whistleblower, Mr. Montgomery. Would you care to clarify your statement for the record?" His face paled, and he retreated without another word. The events of that day set in motion changes that would transform Securitech. Within a week, the board of directors placed Montgomery on administrative leave, pending the outcome of the investigation. 2 weeks later, he resigned to pursue other opportunities. Robert Winters followed shortly after, while Elena Fisher was reassigned to a non-security-related division. The federal investigation confirmed everything I had reported about the Sentinel vulnerability. The final report concluded that the flaw represented a significant and unacceptable risk to military operations, and that management knowingly dismissed valid security concerns and attempted to conceal them from government clients. 3 months after the search warrant was executed, I received a formal letter from Securitech's new interim director, offering reinstatement to my previous position with back pay, a promotion, and additional compensation for the rockin' professional hardship I had endured. More significantly, the letter acknowledged that my actions had prevented a potentially catastrophic security breach and had ultimately strengthened the company's security protocols. My return to Securitech was surreal. Many of the faces were the same, but the culture had changed dramatically. New leadership had implemented robust security reporting procedures with multiple independent review channels. Security concerns were now treated as valuable insights rather than inconvenient obstacles. Abigail greeted me with a warm hug on my first day back. "They're calling it the Alexander Protocol," she said with a smile. "What is?" "The new security review process. Any identified vulnerability automatically triggers a mandatory review that can't be overridden by a single authority. Your stand changed things, Danae. Not just here, but across the industry." In the months that followed, I took on a new role developing security protocols and training programs. The Sentinel project was completely redesigned with security as the primary consideration, and I was asked to lead the vulnerability testing team, a position that would once have been unthinkable for someone who had challenged management so publicly. The experience transformed me professionally and personally. I learned that technical expertise alone isn't enough. Moral courage is equally important in our field. I discovered that standing up for what's right may come with a personal cost, but the alternative, remaining silent when lives are at stake, is far more costly to one's integrity and to those who depend on our work. Most importantly, I learned that systems, whether technical or organizational, are only as secure as the people who build and maintain them. A culture that punishes those who identify weaknesses ultimately creates the perfect conditions for catastrophic failure. Today, when I train new security analysts, I emphasize not just technical skills, but ethical responsibility. I share my story not as a tale of personal vindication, but as a reminder that in cybersecurity, our work affects real people, whose safety depends on our willingness to speak uncomfortable truths. The Federal Whistleblower Protection Act provided the legal framework that allowed me to stand up against a powerful corporation and a vindictive director. But the true protection came from doing what was right even when it was difficult. In the end, that's the most secure position anyone can occupy. Have you ever had to stand up against authority to do what was right? How did you handle the pressure and potential consequences? Share your experiences in the comments below. If you found this story valuable, please like, subscribe, and share it with others who might be facing similar ethical challenges in their professional lives. Remember that one person with courage can make all the difference in protecting others. Thank you for watching, and I wish you the strength to stand firm when your moment of truth arrives.